A third round of talks between Russia and Ukraine is set to be held in Istanbul on Wednesday. Now this as Russia has been escalating its attacks on Ukraine and US President Donald Trump expressing his frustration with the slow pace towards peace. All eyes will now be on Ciragan Palace to see if Ankara can mediate a breakthrough. Priyanka Ramani reports.
Following 2 consecutive months of similar talks, the Ukrainian president announced Monday that negotiation teams would once again be back in Istanbul this week.
I discussed with Rustem Umerov the preparation for a prisoner exchange and another meeting in Turkey with the Russian side. Umerov reported that the meeting is planned for Wednesday.
The Kremlin spokesperson was quick to dismiss the idea that the talks could lead to peace, saying instead that the road ahead is long and complicated.
We have no reason to expect any magical breakthroughs. It's hardly possible in the current situation. We intend to ensure our interests and fulfill the tasks that we set for ourselves from the very beginning.
The Russian and Ukrainian statements were made within hours of a Russian airstrike in eastern Ukraine that killed a 10-year-old boy and injured several others. The attack being just the latest of deadlier, more sophisticated attacks on Ukraine that have devastated the country for months. But whereas neither side is feeling particularly optimistic, the rest of the world is very much holding its breath. Since the last round of talks in June, Donald Trump agreed to sell Ukraine more weapons and has been more critical of President Putin than ever before, while still insisting he can get a deal done.
You know the side I'm on? Humanity's side. I want to stop the killing of thousands of people a week. I want to stop the killing. I want the killing to stop in the Ukraine-Russia war.
Türkiye, too, will be looking for a real path to peace. The country has hosted or mediated all major talks between the Russians and Ukrainians, leading to the Black Sea grain deal, multiple prisoner swaps, and discussions on the return of displaced children. The hope is that the latest round of talks produce something just as, or even more, substantive.
Now, in a moment, we'll talk to Randolph Nogle, who's in Kiev, and Dasha, who's in Moscow. But first, Priyanka Ramani, you're here in Istanbul. What's going to happen today?
Well, Per, it's a question that really only the Ukrainians and the Russians know the answer to as far as what they are willing to negotiate. What we can look at as far as expectations is what has happened in the last 2 rounds that have occurred in May and in June. When that first round of peace talks, direct peace talks occurred, there was a lot of hope. There was a lot of optimism surrounding those talks, and that was completely warranted because it was the first time that these 2 sides were meeting for these direct peace talks in over 3 years. The Secretary of State, the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, was present for those talks. Of course, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan was also there. Turkey, of course, the host. And if you remember, that was actually the same week that Donald Trump was doing his first scheduled foreign tour. So he was in Saudi Arabia, and there was a lot of talk at that time that we might even see a leaders meeting back in May between Trump, Putin, Zelensky, and maybe even President Erdogan. Ultimately, that didn't happen, and what was negotiated in May was a major prisoner swap and also the understanding that peace plans were going to be exchanged, and those plans were exchanged in June. And again, when it comes to the June meeting, there was a lot of momentum leading up to that meeting, but ultimately what was negotiated there was another massive prisoner swap. So when it comes to what we are likely going to see today, I would say that it is going to be likely another prisoner swap. Perhaps there's going to be some discussion of the return of kidnapped children. That has long been a demand of Kiev.
Priyanka Ramani live for us here in Istanbul. Thank you, Priyanka. Let's head to Kiev now, where we've got Randolph Nogle standing by for us. Randolph, what are the Ukrainians hoping to achieve with these talks?
Yes, well, as Priyanka mentioned, I think that there are limited goals with respect to this third round of direct talks. The talks taking place on more of a deputy ministerial level. Rustem Umerov, this is the head of Ukraine's National Security Council. This was the person that basically confirmed that the talks were going to happen on Monday night. We'd even heard mixed reports of when exactly the Russians would arrive, details on who exactly they're sending, but it's expected more on sort of an advisory level. None of the senior sort of ministerial figures really coming to the table yet, and that's because the goals that are being set out are relatively reserved. More prisoner swaps are expected to be discussed, including, as was mentioned earlier, the return of children that had been taken from the occupied territories in eastern Ukraine across the border to Russia, those children being returned, and of course a leaders meeting, which would actually be a huge breakthrough for the Ukrainian side. Volodymyr Zelensky calling for this throughout the last 2 rounds of talks on May 16th and June 2nd. However, it's unlikely, or there's good reason to be skeptical, that a leaders meeting will happen. Of course, we've seen Vladimir Putin cast doubt on the legitimacy of Volodymyr Zelensky as a leader. His 5-year term expired last year. Of course, this country is in a perpetual state of war and martial law is declared. So certainly within the Ukrainian government, everyone totally acknowledging Volodymyr Zelensky's validity. But of course, the Russians were really looking at this as threatening or questioning Ukraine's sovereignty and questioning the validity of their leaders. So a leaders meeting, less likely to happen.
Thanks, Randolph. In Kiev, let's head over to Moscow now, where we've got Dasha Chernisova live for us. Dasha, we've heard from the Kremlin that we shouldn't really expect any miraculous breakthroughs in these talks. So what are the Russians hoping to achieve?
Well, indeed, the Kremlin has already been saying that the issue of the Ukrainian settlement is very complex and therefore any quick breakthroughs are very much unlikely. The Kremlin does expect the complex issues to be discussed without specifying which ones, but also we know that the sides are expected to be touching upon the memorandums that the sides have exchanged in the second round of negotiations. And this is where things get really complicated, because these two documents that envisage the plans to end the conflict and the vision of how this conflict should end are diametrically opposed, and it will be very difficult for the negotiations teams to actually reach an agreement on that. But that does seem to be one of the issues where Russia would be willing to see progress for the ceasefire to be established, and suggesting that without any vision for the future settlement, it will be impossible to reach that ceasefire. In the meantime, we understand that in Moscow there has been some high assessment of the earlier round of talks, suggesting that the prisoner swaps have already been a very important achievement, and stressing that more work will need to be done before the possible meeting between the leaders of these two countries is taking place. But also we understand that there have been some very moderate expectations from the Russian population as well, with a wide majority indeed supporting the idea of the negotiated settlement to this conflict, but many also doubting that it is possible to find compromise at least now, because they suggest that on the ground the situation should be more moved to allow for this negotiated settlement. So it does seem that at this stage negotiations are taking place, but very few expect any quick breakthroughs.
Dasha Chernisova live for us from Moscow. Thank you. As one of the only countries to maintain positive relations with both countries, Türkiye has played a vital diplomatic role in these discussions between Russia and Ukraine. Rahul Rada Krishnan explains.
The first direct high-level talks since the war began were held at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum in March 2022, hosted by Türkiye. No breakthrough was achieved, but it marked an important step in diplomacy. Discussions continued in Istanbul a fortnight later. Both sides provided draft proposals, but the talks were later unilaterally suspended by Ukraine, citing a lack of security guarantees while accusing Russia for its attacks on civilians in Bucha. Russia and Ukraine signed the vital grain deal in July 2022, with Türkiye and the UN brokering the deal. It has been renewed 3 times, but a year later, Moscow suspended its participation, citing ongoing barriers to its own exports. Türkiye's National Intelligence Agency facilitated a major prisoner exchange in 2024, freeing 26 citizens from the US, Russia, Germany, Poland, Norway, and Belarus. This underscored Türkiye's reputation as a reliable mediator. And in May this year, delegations from the two countries met in Istanbul, the first such meeting in 3 years. The talks were attended and moderated by Hakan Fidan, the Turkish foreign minister, and his U.S. counterpart, Marco Rubio. The outcome included another prisoner swap and a channel for dialogue to end the war. A second round of Istanbul talks the following month did not yield results due to disagreements between both sides over the terms for a comprehensive ceasefire. But behind-the-scenes efforts for an agreement are still underway.
And joining me here in the studio now is Helen Sari. She's an associate professor of international relations at the Istanbul Mediate University. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us here. How important would you say that Turkey has been in making these talks happen?
Well, it's a very significant role that I'd underline, because there's so much suffering and pain all around Turkey, and not only Gaza, in Ukraine, in elsewhere, we see lots of killings, murders of children, civilians. So it's a very important task for a country like Turkey to come forward and say that we should stop that. Of course, the great power is the United States of America, and Donald Trump already underlined that it's very important to reach a ceasefire. But we need mediating countries like Turkey who can play a role between the East and the West, namely Ukraine and the West, and Russia especially.
So why Turkey? What is it about the Turkish diplomatic efforts that has been able to achieve these talks and get the two sides to come here to Istanbul and meet?
First of all, I think we have the trust, the confidence of, let's say, both sides that we can play such a role. We can have open dialogue channels both with Ukraine and Russia, as well as the United States and the rest of Europe. And also geopolitically, Turkey is at the center of this conflict, which is being influenced by the going on clashes all around our country. For that reason, I think Turkey comes forward as a mediator. And the most important thing that we should underline is that the trust that it could receive from the conflicting sides.
You mentioned the word trust.
Yes.
Is that important as a mediator?
It is very important, but technically I think what Turkey is doing at the moment is facilitation, and generally we say mediation, which is very important as well, but trust is the most significant factor if you would like to play a role in between two different conflicting sides to stop the clashes.
So what kind of outcome do you think we should expect from these talks?
Well, not today. I think that it's a technical meeting that we are going to see today, as Russia is also underlining that we shouldn't expect any miraculous outcome from today. But the most important thing is that the dialogue channels are still open, and this is what Turkey is trying to do.
So just to get them together in the same room, that is important.
Exactly, because if we stop that, if there's no dialogue, direct dialogue, especially between these two countries, there will be much more clash.
All right, Professor Ertem, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.